This video is part one of a new series of mini projects in which I shoot one roll of film focusing on one theme or idea. For the first one, I decided to shoot landscapes behind road signs. As you can see, the first image is tough to look at. Most of the work was completed in the first few weeks of spring. Essentially, anytime I saw a road sign, I pulled over and looked behind it. Often I made photographs if I thought the landscape was interesting, but sometimes I didn't. Because spring was starting to really blossom, I found that the colors and textures of the landscape was quite compelling in a lot of these cases. And I think in general, finding spaces that you would never consider looking at or even have a chance to look at unless you looked for them is an interesting idea. Because we speed so fast along the road, we normally look at the road sign, but not the landscape that lies behind it. I wasn't as strict as you might think. Oftentimes I saw a road sign that looked interesting as far as the landscape behind it, pulled over, and then walked around and tried to make a photograph from what I saw. Sometimes it was directly behind the road sign, and sometimes I had to walk a little bit to discover something new. Most of the landscapes tend to be consistent with my style, in which I like to include a lot of foreground, midground, and background elements to try to create some sort of harmony or flow despite having a very busy frame. Overall, I was quite pleased with the way Fuji Xperia Extra rendered the scenes and the colors. Although I did find that when shooting backlit scenes, the colors tend to go a little bit flat, but it's something I can definitely fix in Lightroom. I was drawn to the parallel diagonal here of the fallen tree in the distance and the leaning tree in the foreground. Here you can see some plastic that's draped on the tree. A lot of the trees behind some of the signs had obviously litter, and some of them look like they were marked for something of a future date. This was actually the first shot from the frame next to a creek, and it's a little more backlit, and as you can see, the color is a little bit flat and the highlights are a little harsher, when in actuality they should look a little warmer. This is off of an exit ramp, and just the Ferris wheel was an interesting element, and the shadow from the ramp itself, from that tree. This was one of my favorite shots from the roll. I didn't focus very well here, and of note, I shot the entire roll of film on my Pentax K1000 at 1/125th of a second, and then just adjusted the aperture based on what I was getting from the light meter. Another backlit shot, and you can see the colors went flat here. Those greens should be a little warmer and a little more saturated. And this was actually a little disappointing because I thought this scene looked better, but I'm still happy with it. I just need to make some adjustments in Lightroom. This is actually off of a highway wall on a service road, and I was drawn to the way the trees, or not so much the trees, but just the way a landscape is kind of sandwiched in between highways and roads. And again, another backlit shot where the shadows tend to go pretty flat or pretty dark, and the highlights tend to get a little flat as well. But this was one of the more chaotic landscapes that I found. In the middle of the roll, I had this weird overlapping frame thing that was happening. A little disappointing because I like this one with this lone shoe on the road, but the other frame on the left overlapped. I'm not sure why. One of the few where I actually included the road sign element. As you can see, the two metal poles of the road sign is there, but I wanted to include that cone. I thought it was a nice juxtaposition to include some of the elements of the road signs. Another highway kind of sandwiched landscape in between a service road and the highway wall. And these kind of landscapes, I think, are really, really just rich with things and stories to tell, because there are landscapes that are hanging on that are kind of struggling in some ways and really have evidence of the road next to them in terms of the health of the landscape. Here's one of the few vertical shots I made. I just thought the leaning tree in the distance was a nice juxtaposition to the colorful bush and some of the road included as well. And I think it's also cool to show some of the road in some of these shots, just to break up just showing the landscape as I did in most of the shots. Another frame issue here. Again, a little disappointing because it looks like I might have ruined a pretty good shot, but it's an interesting result. This one's nothing special, but it is a landscape behind a roadside, and oftentimes this is what you'll find, especially when you're up on hills. You look down and you kind of see these weird swampy places. One of the more different examples, but also favorite shots from the roll, we have this old growth tree. I love how there's like a window frame from the fence, the wood fence, in the foreground weeds. It's a really nice shot and actually gave me an idea for another project. Again, up on a hill looking down on a landscape. This is a landscape you would never see unless you pulled over, got out, and walked to the edge of the road and looked down, which I think is a really fascinating way to photograph. Obviously, we want to go places we've never been, but oftentimes the places and landscapes that are right near us, there's so much to discover if we just get out of the car and think to look in a new location or place. An example of that also would be going behind a shopping center or behind buildings. One of the few shots where you can actually see some human elements of living in the background. There's a house up on the hill, and I really like this shot because there's a lot of foreground, midground, and background information that tells a story. And I think doing this project in early spring gives it a certain flavor. It would be interesting to do the project again in each season. I think summer would probably be the hardest because of how much green there would be, but I still think it would be cool. This is actually one of my favorite shots from the roll. I realize it's nothing special, but there's just something about that tree hanging on underneath the bridge and just the harshness of it and the way it's gestured. And this is also one of my favorite shots from the roll. It kind of breaks up the lush landscapes that are on most of the roll and focuses on a detail of this kind of burnt out or dead tree on the side of the highway. Another vertical image where I was using the divider to break up the frame horizontally, and I thought it was kind of an interesting idea, but in the end, nothing too special. I like this one a lot too. It kind of shows the landscape in between two roads and how unhealthy and almost odd they seem. And the sign up on the hill says shopping mall, which I think tells an interesting story as well. Again, this was on that same hillside, but a little further to the right of the last shot. I just love how these landscapes are kind of struggling. I mean, I don't love that they're struggling, but I love the visual aesthetics and the stories that these landscapes tell. Here is actually the last shot from the roll. There's a couple more rolls to show you from this video, but this was actually the last shot as I was just trying to finish the roll. Or maybe it was the second to last shot, I'm not sure. And on a little bit of a bridge looking down from below the road onto this creek, I liked how this tree and this landscape was reflecting in that lush early spring kind of swampy creek. And this is that same creek, but looking up a little higher, you can see a bridge on the other side. And I was just trying to finish the roll at this point, so I was kind of clicking away to finish it since I was just kind of anxious to get the roll done. I think we've all kind of been there, know that feeling. And this was the last shot. It's totally different from the rest of the roll in that you see a house pretty close and the cars, but I just wanted to finish the roll, and I thought that tree and the intersection was a pretty cool scene. So I hope you